Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit,
the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes.
Okay, now let's get on with the show.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Alternative Exit. Today we're joined by Deb Oxley. Deb is a prominent advocate for employee ownership, and that's really came from her time where she served as the CEO of the Employee Ownership Association in the UK. She had a tenure from the 2015 to 2022, and during her time, she had a significant impact on the organisation, growing its reach and its impact. So much so that she was actually awarded an OBE in 2019 for her services to employee ownership and social enterprise. So today, she still continues to influence the sector through her various roles and serving as non-executive directors of employee ownership businesses. And so, Deb, welcome to the Alternative Exit.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you found your way into the employee ownership space.
Probably the same way most people find their way into it. It was by accident. It certainly wasn't something that I was familiar with. So I'd spent my early part of my career in what I would call mainstream business. I'd worked for some large businesses, some smaller businesses. My background was strategy, communications, marketing, and I fell into it because I happened to meet an ex-colleague from one of the big four consultancies here in the UK, and who had at that time had just taken up the role of chief executive at the Employee Ownership. This was back in 2012. And I had a background at that point. I'd worked with membership organisations, I'd worked with lots of SMEs, I'd worked in regional economies. So he persuaded me to join with him, and at a time when the EOA was very modest in size and influence. And it was an opportunity really to lead a campaign, which really excited me. An organisation that, had a really important purpose, but was yet to be heard properly.
Mhm.
So I seriously didn't know anything about employee ownership. I'd obviously heard of the John Lewis Partnership because everybody has in the UK, but I really didn't understand what it was, how it worked, what the benefits were to the business, to people, and to society. So, I fell into it, and I've been here ever since, and I'll probably stay here forever, I would imagine.
Well, that's awesome to hear. Like, it's a very common story when I've been speaking to people in the space that they didn't have a lot of awareness to it prior. And I think this aligns to even sort of a lot of the business owners that I'm speaking to, that they just aren't aware that this isn't an opportunity, an alternative option for them to exit to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges, of course. There are, millions of businesses. I think there's something like 5 million privately owned businesses in the UK. It's virtually impossible to think you can speak to each and every one of those. You have to speak through the intermediary organisations who they trust and rely on, like their accountants, their lawyers, and their bankers. And that became pretty clear, I think, to us back in 2012, that was both our big challenge and our big opportunity. So to really have impact, we had to influence the influencers, because without their support, without their understanding of it and their advocacy for it as an option, it was going to be absolutely impossible. It would be a piecemeal approach. It would rely on serendipity and people happening to speak to a colleague or somebody they knew about what doing. Now that still does happen, and I'm totally aware of that. People meet people at conferences, or they know people through the golf club or whatever it is, and that's how they find out about it. Increasingly, we've now got this fantastic group of professional advisors who are really clued up on what it is as an alternative to maybe a trade sale or a management buyout, and who have got the expertise now and the experience to advocate and advise on employee ownership. sort of supply side, if you like, of the professional services sector, I think is still smaller than it should be. And I think we've still got a long way to go, particularly post transition. So, the pre transition space of accountants and lawyers who can advise and hold hands and guide, I think is fabulous and growing by the day. The post transition space of, so how do we make this work for us and how do we bring it to life? And what about the governance and what about employee engagement? I think that's a space that's still very poorly served.
I guess that sort of makes sense when you're talking about for the efforts that you were doing, like in your time at the EOA, in terms of creating a gateway for companies to be able to get there and utilizing those first touch intermediaries of accountants, lawyers, etc., to drive that awareness. I mean, what type of if you think about that sort of the second order, like the post transition, what type of skills do you think that you need in that in those intermediaries?
If you look at how traditionally privately owned businesses run, and that's the group of businesses we're talking about here. They can be quite self-reliant. They're probably not over-engineered when it comes to governance. So they've probably got the bare levels of governance, and they probably, quite often they don't have even a HR team. They just have somebody who does HR. So, what you really want is the professionals who understand how to engage. So the employee engagement space, what does it mean to engage? What is the difference between engagement and communications? You need people who understand the governance aspects of employee ownership and how do the bodies work together. So if you've now got a trust in place, for example, if you have an EOT, then how does that work with the main board? And what if we establish a voice group, an employee forum, or an employee council? How does that work? And then there's the leadership piece as well. How do you lead in an employer owned business when previously you may have been a leader in a non employer owned business with a hierarchy that had one or two founder owners? It can change the dynamics. And I think it's about being consciously aware of what needs to change and how you need to change in order to maximize the value and the benefit of employee ownership. Otherwise, you become employee owned. It says it on the tin, but when you open the tin, it looks, tastes, and smells exactly the same as it did before you became employee owned. Now, that's not what anybody wants. Nobody goes through the effort of doing this just to end up with exactly the same outcome. What we want to see is more prosperous businesses, more innovative businesses, businesses that are thriving and serving their local communities. And you only get that if you switch on employee ownership.
Yep. Well, look, when you talk about sort of switching on that employee ownership, there's somewhere you've written in the past about the whoosh effect experienced by
Mm,
businesses who are
mm.
transitioning to employee ownership. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that is?
Yeah, that phrase came out of an inquiry that we led at the EOA back in 2018 called the Ownership Effect Inquiry. And we were really seeking evidence because at that point in time, we had very little evidence of the impact of employee ownership. And we realized that was one of our limits in that space between 2012 and 2018. We had a lot of goodwill, but we didn't have the evidence to back up what we were saying. And so we ran an inquiry, and in the midst of that inquiry, going around the country, going around the whole of the mainland UK, it was actually in Wales. It was a company called Arbor Instruments, and I remember it distinctly. And they talked about this whoosh effect, and what they had described is subsequently something I've heard lots of business owners describe, which is they really think they've got a fantastic business already. The people are amazing and they're very committed and they have a very open culture and everybody can say what they think. But what happens when they put in the structures of employee ownership, where suddenly everybody recognizes they have an ownership stake and they can have a say in what's going on? It switches on a level of discretional effort that they have not seen before. People's relationship with the business changes and they start to think and act like owners. So suddenly they are concerned about leaving the lights on or not getting the best price for stationery or wondering if they've, missed an opportunity with a potential client. And everybody turns into a sort of semi salesperson overnight and a semi accountant and starts having a level of responsibility. And that's when you see that change in performance, which I don't think many of the owners who go into employee ownership are doing it for that reason. They're normally doing it because they're trying to effectively and sensibly manage their own succession out of the business. And they feel that this is the right, route for them. they don't think actually it's going to lead to a discernible change in performance, but that indeed does happen if you lay the groundwork for switching on employee ownership. If you don't, then you'll have hopefully, a fantastic succession journey, but you won't necessarily feel the benefits, the additional benefits of employee ownership unless you switch it on. So that whoosh effect can happen there. There is a second point in time where it sometimes is talked about. And another company in the sector referred to it as Financial Freedom Day, and it has now become known as that. And that's the point at which the exiting owners are finally paid off what they're owed for their equity. And suddenly the business is in truly an independent stage where it has no further debt obligations to the owners and can start to take, as a board and as a group of employee owners, some decisions about how to reinvest or how to distribute the proceeds of success through profit. So there's those two moments in time which I think come after the transition to employee ownership, which are quite important for businesses. And yeah, it was a fabulous thing to hear about the whoosh effect. I remember it clearly when we were in Cardiff.
Absolutely. I loved hearing about that explanation, because and hearing how these employees in this already really run business like change their behavior. I think it's amazing. I mean, what are the key things that the businesses who are making this transition need to do to bring the whoosh effect into life?
Other people have said in the past, employee ownership is about sharing. It's about sharing information, it's about sharing influence, and it's about sharing reward. That concept of engaging people at a adult level, you know, far too many businesses, the owners, the leaders of the business think they have to protect their employees. We can't tell them about the finances of the business because they just won't understand it, will they? Well, they will, because they all run their own personal finances. They might not understand the terminology, but a bank account, a mortgage, the grocery bill every week is not dissimilar to sales revenue coming in, fixed costs going out, and whatever's left at the end of the month. The reserves that we might carry forward. So if you can bring people's financial literacy to the right level, they can start to understand how the business works. So that's about sharing information. Sharing influence is about giving them a voice and hearing that voice. Now, that doesn't mean that when the group of employees say, we demand private healthcare, the business turns around and says, yes, okay, we'll have to give you that then. Absolutely not. It's for employees' voices to be heard as a collective and as individuals, new ideas for how to improve the business, develop opportunities, make it a better place for employees to be, so you can recruit the right people. But having some formal routes to influence and hear that employee voice is really important. And then, of course, sharing the proceeds of success. So sharing reward, which obviously doesn't mean sharing all of the profit. We all know, and anybody who's involved in employee-owned businesses know that, every business has to act sensibly when it comes to profit and distribute what's an appropriate amount in order that the business can continue to invest and reinvest for its future growth. So I think that's a really important principle of how you create that whoosh effect. Then you've also, going back to what I said earlier, you've got to have the right level of engagement with
Mhm.
employees, sharing information at regular moments in time. You've got to have leaders who are fit for purpose. So it's no good carrying on leading in an authoritarian way, command and control. That is completely counterintuitive to expecting people to step up into new levels of responsibility if you just continue to just tell them what to do all of the time. So there has to be a higher level of, I think, trust between leaders and employees. And then the governance is important. And it's the boring bit that people roll their eyes up when you say the word governance. And I'm not talking about it becoming onerous, but it is really important because in an employee owned structure, if you have a majority of the shares owned by the employees collectively or individually through shares, then it does change the relationships between the main operating board and that ownership group. And you've got to be clear about where the roles and responsibilities lie, who's got authority to make decisions, who's simply going to be consulted and who's going to be informed. And if you don't do that at the outset, it can lead to confusion later on. And that then undermines the very essence of what you're trying to create.
Yeah, I find when you mention the word governance, a lot of people's eyes just glaze over. It's just a super boring kind. But I think when you sort of the way you articulated there at the end, it just hey, look, let's just figure out who makes these decisions, like who's responsible, who needs to be informed. It can bring that to life.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it is the bit that I think the accountants and the lawyers are really good at helping businesses as they go through that transitional phase. They will guide and help in that respect. But I still think it takes a little bit of time for the business to get its head around, well, what does that mean? How many times do we meet? And, what's the role of the trustees? And if we have employee trustees, are they different to the other trustees on the board? And how should we elect our employee trustees? And is it an election or is it an appointment? So there's so many questions to answer, which if you invest the time at the outset in getting that right, it just serves you really well for the future. If you ignore it and think, well, we'll just see how it goes, invariably, in my experience, it always leads to problems later on.
Okay. Yeah, look, that aligns. One of the other guests we had previously, Christian Wilson, who's a lawyer in the space, he sort of talked about how, look, a lot of the times he'd be speaking with companies who have gone through the process or going through it, and their lawyers or accountants were able to provide them some really great information about, hey, look, what does it look like? What does the structure look like? But there was this massive gap. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's what you alluded to earlier. Is great. We've got the
Yeah, yeah.
information. How do we implement it?
But I think that of the other benefit now, here as we sit here nearly in 2025, is that there are lots of companies to learn from.
Yeah.
You know, go back to 2012, the number of employee-owned businesses was substantially less. I'm talking probably less than 100. And, we're going to be somewhere up in the 2000s, I'm sure, by the end of 2025. So you can find employee-owned businesses in every sector of the economy of every size. And if you're a member of the Employee Ownership Association, for example, you've got access to this fantastic community where you can learn from others as well as from the professionals, because you want to learn how other people have done it, what's worked, what hasn't worked for them. And I think that makes this sector quite unique because regardless of what profession you are in, you will always find people who are willing to share their knowledge and their experience with you. There's no competition, even when the businesses are in the same professional sector. They're very happy to share with each other.
Yeah, I think that's I guess something that's been a really common theme is just the generosity of everyone in the employee ownership space,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think that that's like on the back of the amazing growth that of employee-owned businesses in the UK. As I said, there's just so many of those opportunities for to learn, which is something I've been taking advantage of as well. But when you think about the this growth that we've had that you've experienced in the UK in employee ownership, I mean, in the past, you've talked about sort of the role of employee ownership in fostering inclusive and resilient communities. I mean, how does the model like contribute to this economic stability and community development?
Um, well, when we did the inquiry back in 2017, 18, and subsequently, you've seen the work of the Knowledge Programme and the People Powered Growth Report from the EOA. It's really clear that if you can create a critical mass of these businesses in a regional economy, that what you start to see is these businesses are more likely to employ people and retain people, even in down times and difficult economic conditions. They're more likely to give generously in terms of charitable endeavours, and that's just not cash, that's also people's time. They become very locked into their local supply chain. And, that is the benefit, of course, isn't it, of a business transitioning into employee ownership rather than being bought out by a competitor who may take that business from the area and, the subsequent loss of jobs and the impact on the supply chain. These businesses tend to root themselves in their communities, and they have probably been there for possibly, a couple of generations already if they're a family owned business. But this is a way of, sustaining that impact that they have. And then you've got the very nature of these businesses where because of the levels of engagement and involvement and influence, they are more innovative. So they are looking to grow and develop, counter to urban myths about, employee-owned businesses being a bit lazy or maybe not, being as fleet of foot as other businesses. I think it's the complete opposite, and the evidence shows you that because you've got instead of one or two people at the top of the tree who are coming up with all the ideas of how to, develop the business and move it to the next level, you've got the whole workforce who are constantly, I mean, to the point of irritation probably for some leaders. You've got lots of people all the time coming up with ideas. Why don't we do this? Why have we never done that? And that ultimately breeds more innovation. One of the businesses that I sit on as a non-exec now, an employer manufacturing business in Yorkshire, I was with them yesterday. They were receiving their King's Award for Enterprise for innovation. And the Lord Lieutenant who presented it did a fabulous speech, and was very insightful, giving her view of why that innovation gene, if you like, was so alive in the business. And she absolutely concluded it was to do with the employee ownership piece. And I would say that, wouldn't I? But you see it now in the evidence. It really does trigger a more creative, curious mindset. And because people are the owners, they're not just switching off at 5 o'clock, and they're not just doing their day job. They're thinking in a much more holistic way about what the business needs and what their ideas might do. So I think that's why it's a powerful force in communities, and I often talk about employee ownership. Yes, businesses have to do well, but employee ownership businesses are also doing good. And you see that increasingly. I mean, even at a personal level, if you think about the hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals across the UK now who have either sat on a trust board as an employee trustee or they've sat on an employee council. Those individuals have now been exposed to a level of decision making and involvement in a business that they would never have had the opportunity to previously. And many of them will go out then into the community and want to do other similar things in their community. They might become a school governor or a local councillor or just offer some voluntary help to organisations. But I've seen that unlock potential in people who previously have come to the table quite nervous, not quite sure what they've put themselves forward for, but they realise actually this game of business is not so complicated after all, and they can make a valued contribution. And that's because they've been given the opportunity through employee ownership.
Yeah, I love that last one. We talk about actually having that greater contribution just by a better understanding of what's actually involved. It's just taking back the veil. I'd love to dig into a little bit more of that, the element of innovation. And that just sort of brings up something that I hear uh, a lot from owners and chatting to them about the transition, and they sit there and they get concerned that how's the company going to innovate without me at the head, like of this entrepreneurial engine? And it's really interesting to hear that, like, it's not that they really suffer from, the EO organizations suffer from indigestion of ideas rather than of starvation when they're in this new model. So can you talk about some ways in which how sort of employee-owned businesses are managing, this innovation engine from of their employees to ensure that the right ideas come to the top, and that the sort of the cycle keeps coming?
Well, I've made the point first of all that what I'm not suggesting is that you don't need the disruptors. You don't need the innovators. You do, of course, because employee ownership is a change of ownership, not a change of leadership. That's really important. You still need leaders in the business with discrete responsibilities and capabilities and experience and skills. So you still need a finance director, you still need an operations director, you still need a people and culture expert, because there is a myth held by people who are not in employer-owned businesses that when you become employer-owned, all of a sudden all of that structure disappears and everybody's making every decision, which clearly is not true. So you still need specialisms. And, for a business that is driven by innovation, the one I was just talking about is exactly like that. They set themselves a target every year of how many products, they require to be sold that are classed as new products as a percentage of total sales. That's how important innovation is. So they have got a whole function, the ideas and innovation function, which exists just to seed and fuel and grow and implement those ideas. It's not an accidental thing that happens. So I wouldn't want to confuse the fact that you don't need that, because you absolutely do. And I'm not an expert in any one sector, but I'm sure in a retail environment, they have specific innovators looking at what the next trends are in homeware or fashion, whatever. And in manufacturing, when you're in highly competitive markets, you've got, brilliant people who understand competitor analysis and who are looking at how you need to continue to evolve and innovate products. I think the question you're asking is, so how do you manage the masses? How do you manage the mass group of people? I've seen it work in different ways. It's been simplistic as business, another Yorkshire business. I'm not favouring Yorkshire just because I'm from Yorkshire. Yorkshire business. So a manufacturing business again, a very, very open culture, owned by a husband and wife, but quite paternalistic in their outlook. So they owned the responsibility of the business, and they thought in owning that they were taking the pressure off their employees. What they were actually doing was sort of disabling them slightly. So it became the fact that they were the only people who could come up with new ideas, and everybody was comfortable with that because they saw them almost as the parents of the business. When they handed ownership over through an employee ownership trust and the new managing director came in, one of the first ideas he had was, let's get everybody's ideas out. And they literally put a big metal bath in the middle of the factory and said to everybody, write your idea down on pieces of paper and throw it in the bath. It became the ideas bath. And from that, the story goes, it's not, I'm describing it as almost like a fairy tale, but if he was here now, he would tell you this, the MD. One of their best selling ideas came from that idea. So that was somebody who worked in the business who had often thought for a long while, why don't we sell a product that does this? Because when he's out in the field with the customers, he was hearing that that would have been really helpful. And it took the opportunity of just being told, there's a vessel over there, throw your ideas in, doesn't matter what the idea is, and we'll take a look at it. So that's a very informal way. Another business that I'm involved in, when they became employee owned, they set their council up, and the first thing they asked them was, we'd like you to go out into the workplace and ask everybody for any ideas they have about how to improve the efficiency of our business. So it was a very specific ask. And I think therein lies one of the challenges. You have to be specific, because if you just say to people, have you got any ideas? Well, of course, everybody's got ideas. Every single one of us has ideas, but are they the ideas that are going to move the ship faster? Are we going to achieve more? Are we going to go further? So be more specific about the questions you're asking. So how can we improve our efficiency? How can we improve our presence in the market? How can we improve our offer for our employees so we attract and retain more people? If you can ask very specific questions, I think you will get a wealth of ideas back. I think the culture in which those ideas lands has to be right, so that people recognize that just because they've voiced an idea does not mean it's going to necessarily be taken forward, because there is a process to go through. And that's where that financial literacy is so important, because if people appreciate in asking or suggesting this, there is a financial impact, which is this, then they can start to see where and how decisions are taken about the most effective innovations. What are we going to do next? Well, if we do this, the cost to the business is X, and actually the return on investment is going to be less than X, so it's not worth us doing it. If you can take the time to explain that, I think you get better take up of the ideas that you do then take forward. I remember when we were doing the inquiry, one of the larger professional services businesses in the built environment was asked by one of the panel, does employee ownership slow down decision making? And he said, this was the leader at the time, said, it does. But I'm willing to take that, because what it does is it speeds up implementation, and it makes implementation less. There's less hassle associated with it, because
less change management required.
Yeah. So it might take you longer to get to the desired result, but along the way, you've engaged hearts and minds. You've allowed people to have their say. You've explained why your decision has been made. And then when it comes to the implementation, it's really straightforward. And that's where most of the problems happen, in implementation, because people are resistant to change. So I don't know if that's answered your question, Andy.
No, absolutely. Like it's given a couple of different flavors of, I think, how they sort of drive that innovation. Like I love the idea that we need to educate people to think about it in like a mini business case, but they need to have that knowledge to be able to do that. Just want to pull the thread on something that you did mention about sort of you need to be specific about the questions that you're asking. So, or what type of innovations you're looking for. Now, to know what you need to do there means you have to have a really clear business as to where the direction of the business is going. You've talked about sort of leadership and maintaining that structure, but what are some, if you could share an example of two, maybe like from a Yorkshire business or somewhere else, I don't know, but of how they, of how they get the engagement of the employees on the direction of the business rather than just on sort of those little innovations of products and efficiencies.
Well, obviously, I mean, it all goes back to purpose, doesn't it? I think unless you've got clarity of purpose, you're not going to take people with you. And dependent on the size of the business, I think then depends how do you get to the point of defining your purpose, your mission, your vision, and your values. In smaller organisations, it's definitely the case that you can probably involve the whole team in that because it's if you're a single site less than 100 people, maybe even 200 people, you can probably afford the time and the investment to actually involve people in all of that. And certainly, evidence shows that when you do that, when people actually understand why we are doing something and what my connection to that is, then it's a visceral connection that means that every day they're coming in thinking, I'm doing this because it's helping us achieve that. One of the businesses I work with, the way that comes to life is people have what they call a personal business plan. So every year they start the year with a set of objectives which are entirely aligned to the purpose of the business and the business strategy. So they can see that direct link between their job here and it's actually contributing to this particular objective. And that gives a level of personal accountability which is really clear for everyone. So if you're not doing something that's adding or contributing to the strategy and therefore the delivery and achievement of our purpose, then you really shouldn't be doing it. And that level of connection, I think, is very powerful. I mean, if you look at the biggest employer-owned businesses, I would say probably they have to take a different approach. So yes, consulting. So it goes back to that thing about decision making, consultation, and information. Who's been informed, who's been consulted, and who's making the decision. Where it works well, and I'm not suggesting that every employer-owned business does this brilliantly well because they're just businesses. So some do, some don't. But where it works well, even at scale, is that you are listening to people, even if they're not involved in the decision making, and they can see that loop back to you said we did. So what we heard from the business was this. And maybe some of what you're hearing isn't just at the point at which you're defining strategy or vision, it's the ongoing engagement. So many of these businesses will undertake an annual employee engagement survey, which is not just about asking questions like, how satisfied do you feel and, how trusted and valued do you feel, which is a very personal thing. It will ask questions about how well do they understand the strategy of the business and how well do they see their own contributions adding to that strategy. And, if you recognize that actually that's not working quite so well, as a business leader, you can pull the lever on we need to do more in connecting the day to day to the strategy. There's a range of different answers to that question, dependent on the size of the business, dependent on whether you're single-sided, multi-sided, national or international. It's all going to vary, but the basic principle remains you need to connect people with your purpose. They need to understand the strategy and they need to know what their contribution to that strategy means. So that, it's easier to say, why are you doing that when we all need you to do this? Because what you're doing over here isn't contributing.
Yeah, I think part of what I loved about the sort of description you gave in terms of defining what the company's purpose also creates more purpose for the individuals too. They're coming to work, actually contributing to something greater than just their job. And yeah, like for me, that's something that's really powerful. So I want to ask you sort of one more question before we sort of dive into sort of a fast round. I mean, what do you see as the biggest barrier for growth for employee ownership?
Well, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, it would definitely have been, as I mentioned, it was that intermediary space and their awareness. We're now in a very different place. So actually we've got, in the UK at least, we've got a very attractive tax environment. Actually, I think we've got a great tax environment for moving businesses at the right point, into an employee ownership trust model, maybe with a SIP or another sort of direct share scheme added alongside it. We've got professional advisors who are really well advised and themselves and able to advise businesses. I think the financial sector needs to be developed. So, how do businesses access funding and where do they get the funding to support not just their transition into employee ownership, but their growth? And I think that is an issue for all SMEs in the UK, especially. Many SMEs don't like taking on debt.
Yeah,
Um,
or nor a personal guarantee required
yeah,
to take on the debt.
yeah, but they don't like taking on debt as well. I work with quite a few who are very proudly debt free. But for me, that feels like there's some sort of restriction holding them back, possibly from growth. But where do they get that finance from? Is it patient capital? Is it patient, that it's not, the sort of capital that's looking for a quick exit? Can they get funding for the transition? That's another, I think that whole area of finance for employee ownership, both in transition and growth, um, needs some more development. We're still also, we're still what I would call a minority sport. Even with 2,000 employee-owned businesses out of 5 million businesses across the UK, and even if you took out all the sole traders, you've still got a couple of million businesses in the UK, and we are a very small number. By absolute number, our economic contribution is greater than our size, of course, but we're still very small. So we still need huge advocacy for employee ownership. And in order to do that, we need to demonstrate, that we're a credible part of the economy, that we make an important contribution. And that's why the work that the EOA continue to do to lobby politicians is critically important. And the evidence that we've now got is the best evidence we've ever had through the People Powered report.
Yeah, look, the evidence that you've been sharing with us here has been amazing, and it's overwhelming in favour of the power of employee ownership, which is just amazing. So, it's been an amazing conversation to so far. But before we go, I want to ask you just a couple of like a fast round of questions. I'm just going to ask you 3 questions, and you can offer a quick response.
Okay, right.
Okay,
Okay.
who is the leader that you most admire in employee ownership?
Gosh, that is so hard. Oh my goodness, that is such a hard. Um, if you'd have stopped just and said, Which leader do I most admire?" It's actually somebody who isn't in the employee ownership space anymore, but I met through employee ownership, and that was a lady called Sasha Romanovich, who was the managing partner at Grant Thornton. I hugely admired her leadership style in the round. If you ask me who is the leader that I most admire in employee ownership, oh gosh, that is such an unfair question. There are so many. Honestly,
Well,
there are
not
so
asking. It's all right. I won't. I'm sure. I won't. I promise. I won't tell anyone that. Yeah, if you. If
there,
you
there, there are so many who I think embody what it means to be a leader in an employee-owned business. Neil Wright, who works for an employee-owned business, who I met many years ago, is somebody that I think has wholeheartedly dived into employee ownership and has truly offered his team the opportunity to have a real discernible influence on the business for the benefit of the business. They're a technology company in personal care products, and he and I had a really interesting conversation the last time I met him about one of their latest products that came to market, which again came from one of his team, sat around the table, offering their ideas, another product that just came out of that type of conversation. So yeah, if I was there we go. Neil will not expect me to say that, but
okay,
yeah, Neil's great.
fantastic. I'll be reaching out to him. Secondly, what is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
EOA website, the EO hub. It's got everything I need. If I want to find, I wonder if anybody's done this. I go and have a look in the EO hub.
Yep. Okay, fantastic. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. And then finally, what would you say to a business owner who's sitting on the fence regarding a transition to an employee-owned model?
Why would you not? Why would you not look at it? It may not be right for your business, but you'd be quite naive and a little bit irresponsible not to at least consider it.
Love that. Love the simplicity. Deb, thank you so much for your time and for sharing so much wisdom today about, I guess, the benefits and sort of how to actually turn employee-owned businesses into thriving organizations that impact the community. Where can people follow you if they'd like to sort of learn more or reach out?
Well, I work independently now, so I don't have a flashy website. I don't have a website at all. You can find me on LinkedIn, Deb Oxley. You can find me on Twitter/X at Deb Oxley. Yeah, that's probably where. And if you want to touch base with me, Deb at oxleyworks.co.uk.
Brilliant. Deb, thank you very much for your leadership and for your sharing. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Andy.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.